Imagine lying on your back on a strip of coral sand no wider than a city sidewalk, your legs shredded by shrapnel, the roar of battle thinning to a ringing silence inside your skull. And then, through the smoke and the salt haze, a man walks toward you. He is not there to help you. He carries a sword. And in that single suspended moment, with blood soaking into the sand beneath you and no weapon within reach, everything you are, every instinct, every second of training, every ounce of will you have left must answer one question. Are you going to die here, or are you going to fight? This is not a story about a battle. This is a story about one man, 19 years old, who answered that question with his bare hands. And the answer changed the rest of his life. John L. Elab did not go to war because he was told to. He went because the world had caught fire, and like nearly every young man in the United States in the winter of 1942, he could feel the heat even standing still. Pearl Harbor had happened just weeks before he made his decision, and the country was moving fast, loud, and furious toward something no one could yet fully name. Factories were retooling. Newspapers were screaming. Mothers were crying at train stations. And the young men of America were lining up. Elab was 19 years old. He had no illusions about glory. His explanation for enlisting was as honest and unadorned as the man himself would prove to be throughout his entire life. The war was on, and everyone and his brother were joining it one way or another. So he did. It was not a speech. It was not a declaration. It was simply the plain logic of a generation that understood, without needing it explained, that some things required your participation whether or not you were ready. He walked into the United States Marine Corps as a rifleman, and the Corps began the long and methodical process of turning a 19-year-old from civilian life into something that could survive what was coming. Boot camp stripped away everything soft. It replaced comfort with discipline, hesitation with reflex, and the softness of ordinary life with the hard geometry of military survival. Private Elab graduated and received his orders. He would not be staying in the continental United States. He was going to Samoa, a chain of volcanic islands deep in the South Pacific, where the war had already taken on a character and a ferocity that no training manual could fully prepare a man to understand. He linked up with his unit there, the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marine Regiment, 2nd Marine Division, and began what would become a slow, brutal, island-by-island education in the nature of this particular war. The Pacific War was unlike any conflict the United States had fought before. In Europe, the war had roads, cities, familiar geography, a landscape that bore some resemblance to the world soldiers had grown up in. In the Pacific, the war was conducted across thousands of miles of open ocean, on islands so small they barely appeared on maps, under a sun that pressed down like a physical weight. The jungle was not a setting. It was an adversary. Heat, humidity, disease, and terrain conspired together as a fourth front in addition to the Japanese imperial forces, who were some of the most tenacious and fanatical fighters in the history of warfare. From Samoa, Elab's regiment moved toward the Guadalcanal campaign, a name that had already begun to carry a particular weight in the American consciousness, half legend, half nightmare. Guadalcanal was the first major Allied offensive operation in the Pacific theater, a grinding, grueling campaign fought in jungle so dense that men sometimes could not see 10 feet in front of them. It was a campaign measured not only in yards of ground taken and given, but in bodies, in fever, in the slow attrition of men who were rotting from the inside out before they ever faced a Japanese bayonet. Because it was there, on Guadalcanal and across the broader Pacific theater, that the invisible enemy revealed itself. Malaria. According to the United States Army Office of Medical History, Malaria was the single most serious health hazard to Allied troops in the South Pacific area during the entire Second World War. It caused more than 5 times as many casualties as did combat. 5 times. That number demands to be held still and examined, because it dismantles a certain romantic idea about warfare. The idea that the enemy you face always carries a weapon you can see. On Guadalcanal, the enemy was a parasite injected by a mosquito in the dark, and it did not care about rank, about training, about bravery, or about anything a man had to offer except his blood and his body heat. Elab did not escape it. He wrote later plainly and without embellishment that he, like all the rest, got malaria. The phrase is extraordinary in its quietness, like all the rest, as if he were describing something as ordinary as rain, as inevitable as the tides. He did not dramatize it. He did not detail the fever, the violent shaking, the delirium, the way a man's temperature could spike so high that he lost the boundary between sleeping and waking, between memory and hallucination. He simply noted it the way a carpenter might note that a board warped in the wet season. It happened. It was part of the work. But malaria had real consequences for operational capacity, and the Corps recognized this. Elab and the men of his regiment were pulled back, sent to New Zealand for 9 months to recover, to rest, and to prepare. 9 months. In New Zealand, a country that was beautiful and green and quietly ordinary in ways that must have felt almost hallucinatory after Guadalcanal, these men slept in real beds and ate real food, and tried to rebuild their bodies into something capable of what was being planned for them next. Because what was being planned for them was Tarawa. The name alone in the history of the Marine Corps carries the weight of a stone dropped into still water. The ripples never fully stop. Tarawa is the main atoll in the Gilbert Islands, a collection of coral formations in the Central Pacific, sitting in open ocean roughly equidistant between Hawaii and Australia. On a map, Tarawa is almost invisible. Bitio, the specific islet that would serve as the primary objective, was roughly the size of Central Park in New York City, a strip of flat coral and sand barely 2 miles long and less than half a mile wide at its widest point. What made Tarawa important was not its size. It was its position. Tarawa sat at the gateway of the American drive through the Central Pacific toward the Philippines, and the Japanese knew it. They had fortified Bitio with a thoroughness and ferocity that reflected their absolute commitment to hold it at any cost. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, who commanded the Japanese garrison on Bitio, was reportedly confident enough in his fortifications to declare that the island could not be taken by 1 million men in 100 years. He had constructed a defensive network of concrete bunkers, tank traps, wire obstacles, and interlocking fields of fire that covered every possible angle of approach. He had nearly 5,000 men dug into positions that were designed not merely to resist an assault, but to destroy it entirely. The American planners knew it would be costly. They could not have known how costly. On the morning of November 20, 1943, the 2nd Marine Division began its assault on Bitio. What happened in the hours that followed was one of the most catastrophic and heroic sequences of events in American military history, and it unfolded with a particular kind of horror that no pre-battle briefing could have prepared the men for. The trouble began before anyone reached the beach. American naval planners had estimated the water depth over the reef that surrounded Bitio. Their estimates were wrong. The landing craft, the Higgins boats that were meant to carry the Marines across the reef and onto the beach, ran aground hundreds of yards from shore. Some men transferred to Amtraks, the amphibious tractors that could crawl over the reef, but there were not enough of them. Many Marines had no choice but to climb over the sides of their stranded boats and walk, or wade, or swim, through hundreds of yards of open, shallow water toward a beach that was erupting with Japanese fire. The water turned red. Men who had survived Guadalcanal, men who had outlasted malaria, men who had trained for 9 months in New Zealand and had hardened themselves into something close to invulnerable. These men died in the water before they ever reached the shore. Some were hit immediately. Some made it halfway. Some made it most of the way. Some climbed onto the beach only to find that the beach itself offered almost no cover, and the Japanese, firing from fortified positions, had every inch of it zeroed. The first wave was shredded. The second wave absorbed catastrophic losses. By the time the third and fourth waves were going in, the Marines still afloat and still moving forward were crossing water thick with their own dead, climbing over the bodies of men they had trained beside, knowing that they were doing the same thing those men had done, and that the outcome might be identical. And still they went. That is the detail that stops the mind. Still they went. John L. Elab went with them. He was 20 years old now, a private who had already survived Guadalcanal and malaria and 9 months of waiting, and now he was on a landing craft approaching the worst defended beach in the Pacific War, and then he was in the water, and then he was on the beach. What the beach looked like in those hours is difficult to fully render in language. Every account from every survivor describes a sensory environment so extreme that it strained the capacity of human memory to organize it coherently. The sound was continuous and total, the concussion of naval gunfire, the hammering of Japanese machine guns, the explosion of grenades, the detonation of mortar rounds, and underneath all of it, the human sounds, the sounds that no man who heard them ever fully stopped hearing. The air was thick with smoke and coral dust, and the smell of things burning and things that had already burned. The sand was not sand in any ordinary sense. It was coral, sharp-edged and pale, stained in places with colors that coral does not naturally produce. And through all of this, men moved forward, not because they were unafraid, not because they did not understand the mathematics of their situation. They moved forward because that is what Marines do, because the alternative was to stay in the water or stay at the waterline and die there, and because something in the training and the culture and the bone-deep identity of the Corps had created in these men a forward momentum that neither Japanese fire nor their own terror could completely arrest. Elab moved with them, and then the grenade found him. A Japanese grenade detonated close enough to Elab to drive shrapnel into his leg. The specifics of the wound, its exact location, the number of fragments, the depth of penetration, are not recorded in the accounts he left behind. What is recorded is the effect. He went down. He was on the beach, on his back or his side, on the coral that had been stained by 100 other men before him, and his leg was wounded badly enough that he could not stand, could not fight, could not do the things a rifleman is trained to do when the enemy is close. He was, in the language of warfare, out of the fight. And then the Japanese officer appeared. The man came from the direction of the Japanese positions. He was close enough for Elab to see him clearly, to register his rank, to form an impression. Elab described him later as what he believed to be a warrant officer, a man of some authority within the Japanese military structure, a man who carried the ancient weapon of his tradition, a sword. In the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, the sword was not merely a weapon. It was a symbol of rank, of lineage, of the martial culture that defined the Japanese officer class. It had been carried into battle by Japanese officers since the Meiji era, and it had been used in battle. On islands across the Pacific, in encounters that the official histories did not always record clearly, Japanese officers had used their swords. The men who encountered them on the other end of those encounters had no ambiguity about their purpose. The officer saw Elab. Elab saw the officer. They looked at each other. That moment, that pause, that locked recognition between two men on opposite sides of a world war, on a tiny strip of coral in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, one of them standing with a sword, and one of them lying wounded on the ground. That moment is the still center around which everything else in this story rotates. What passed between them in that exchange of looks is unknowable. What each man thought or felt or calculated in those seconds cannot be recovered. But the outcome of that moment is one of the most remarkable acts of individual combat survival in the entire record of the Battle of Tarawa. Elab understood what was about to happen. He put his arm over his head and rolled. It is such a simple thing, such an ordinary movement, rolling. The kind of thing a child does on a grass hill. But here on this beach in this moment, it was the decision that determined whether John L. Elab lived or died. He rolled and the sword came down, and instead of finding his neck or his skull, it found his arm. It cut him, the wound was real, the blade was sharp, and it opened something that would leave its mark on him for the rest of his life. But it did not kill him. And in the same motion, in the same continuous sequence of instinct and desperation, and something that can only be called will, Elab grabbed the sword. With a wounded leg, with a cut arm, lying on his back on a coral beach in the middle of the worst battle in the Central Pacific, with a Japanese warrant officer standing over him, Elab reached up and grabbed the blade or the hilt. The account does not specify which, and he got him. 2 words. He got him. The compact, understated language of a man who spent the rest of his life declining to dramatize what he had survived. He got him. The Japanese officer died on the beach where he had come to deliver death, killed by the man he had come to kill, using the weapon he had brought to do it. John L. Elab, wounded in the leg by a grenade, wounded in the arm by a sword, lay on the beach at Battle and continued to breathe. The battle around him continued for 2 more days. The full accounting of the Battle of Tarawa, when it was finally over on November 23, 1943, was staggering. Nearly 6,400 Japanese, Korean, and American service members died in those 76 hours of fighting. The Japanese garrison, which had numbered approximately 4,700 men, was almost entirely annihilated. Only 17 Japanese soldiers survived to be taken prisoner. The Korean laborers who had been pressed into service on the island suffered grievous losses as well. On the American side, more than 1,000 Marines and sailors were killed, and more than 2,000 were wounded. All of this on an island the size of a city park. The casualty rate among the Marines who went ashore at Battle was approximately 30% in the first day alone. The imagery that emerged from Tarawa, the photographs taken by military photographers who accompanied the assault, photographs of bodies floating in the lagoon and sprawled on the beach, shocked the American public when they were published. For the first time in the war, the American government allowed photographs of dead American soldiers to be printed in mainstream publications, a deliberate decision to harden public resolve. The images did harden resolve. They also shattered the comfortable distance that many Americans had maintained between themselves and the actual texture of what was happening in the Pacific. The battle also produced an enormous body of lessons that immediately reshaped American amphibious doctrine. The disaster with the landing craft, the failure of intelligence regarding water depth, the inadequacy of pre-landing naval bombardment against hardened concrete positions, all of these failures were studied and corrected, and the improvements they drove would pay dividends in every subsequent Pacific amphibious operation, from Saipan to Iwo Jima to Okinawa. In a terrible sense, The men who died at Tarawa purchased with their lives the knowledge that saved lives later. That is a transaction no living person could have authorized on their behalf, and it is the kind of moral complexity that does not resolve cleanly. For Elab, the battle's end brought evacuation. The wounds in his leg were serious, more serious than his own account suggests, because the kind of man who describes a sword fight from the ground as getting the other guy tends to be the same kind of man who downplays the severity of his own injuries. He was sent to the Naval Hospital in San Diego, California, where surgeons and nurses and the accumulated medical knowledge of a nation at war did what they could with what a Japanese grenade and a Japanese sword had done to a 20-year-old Marine from a generation that joined the war because it was on, and someone had to. He was treated, he was stabilized, he was evaluated, and the evaluation produced a number, 50% disability. Half of what he had walked into the Marine Corps with was gone, or permanently altered, or had been redistributed by violence into something that functioned differently than it had before. He was released from the hospital carrying that number with him, a bureaucratic rendering of damage that could not fully describe what it was actually like to walk, or to sleep, or to do the 10,000 ordinary things that a body does, and that become complicated when a grenade has been introduced to a leg and a sword to an arm. He did not go back to combat. Private First Class Elab, the rank acknowledgement, the tiny promotion embedded in the title, the Corps' way of saying you survived and you served and we see you, was assigned to a military base in Rhode Island, where he served out the remainder of the war through 1945. What those months were like for him is not recorded in the accounts that survive. What it meant to be a wounded Marine at a stateside base while the war continued without him, while the men he had served beside were fighting at Saipan and Tinian and Peleliu, and eventually Iwo Jima. That interior experience belongs to Elab alone, and he did not choose to share it. The war ended in the summer of 1945. The Japanese Empire, which had seemed capable of holding the Pacific forever, was broken by 4 years of grinding attrition, and finally by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, two events so catastrophic in their nature that they forced a surrender that the Japanese military culture might otherwise have refused indefinitely. The soldiers came home. The country tried to absorb them, tried to return to something called normal, tried to build suburbs and produce children and forget, or at least to file away in a place where it did not interfere with daily functioning. The things that had happened on islands with names that most Americans could not have found on a map a decade earlier. Elab went home too. He built a life. He lived. He did the things that living requires: decades of days, of seasons, of the ordinary accumulation of experience that constitutes a human existence when it is not being compressed into the extreme violence of a 76-hour battle on a coral atoll. He carried his 50% disability, the way a man carries an old injury. With him always, sometimes loudly, more often quietly, always present in the background of everything physical he attempted. He ended up in Boise, Idaho, a long way in every sense from Battle Island and the Pacific Ocean, and the water that had turned red. And then in November 2014, 71 years after the battle, he wrote a letter. He addressed it to the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, his old regiment, the unit he had joined in Samoa and carried with him through Guadalcanal and New Zealand and across the Reef at Battle. The letter was not long. It was not eloquent in the way of trained writers. It was the communication of a man who had something to say and said it plainly, the way he had always said things, the way a generation of Americans said things, when they had survived enough that they no longer felt the need to dress their words up in anything but themselves. He was 91 years old when he wrote that letter. 2 years later, when journalists found him in Boise and asked him about his life and his service, and the 76 hours on a beach that had altered the trajectory of everything that came after, he was 93. He had outlived the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the Imperial Japanese Army and Admiral Shibazaki, and the warrant officer with the sword, and most of the men he had served beside, and most of the men who had tried to kill him. His balance was a little off. He felt okay in every way he could, he said. He did not elaborate on what that meant, on the precise geography of okay at 93 when you have lived in a body that was reshaped by a Pacific island in 1943 and has had 7 decades to negotiate its terms with that remaking. He did not need to elaborate. The statement was complete. It was, in its compression and its lack of complaint, perhaps the most exact thing anyone could say about surviving. To the Marines and sailors currently serving, he had a message, not advice, not a warning, not a speech about sacrifice or duty or the burden of history. Just 5 words, offered simply and without ceremony, from a man who had earned the right to say anything at all and chose to say this. Thank you for your service. Consider what is contained in that sentence when it comes from a man like John L. Elab. It is not a platitude. It is not the reflexive courtesy of someone who has not thought about what service means. It comes from a man who knows precisely what service costs, who paid a price that left him with a percentage attached to his disability for the rest of his life, who lay on a beach with a sword coming down at him, and answered the question of whether he would live or die with his bare hands. When that man looks at the people who are serving now and says, "Thank you," the words carry a weight that is almost unbearable to receive. But there is something else in this story that demands attention before it ends. Something that the official records and the casualty counts and the operational analyses do not fully capture. There is the question of what it means to survive something like Battle, not just the physical survival, the getting off the island alive, but the longer survival, the decades of carrying it. Men who fight in the kinds of battles that Tarawa represents do not simply experience them and then move on. The experiences live in them, in the neurological pathways carved by extreme stress, in the body's cellular memory of what it felt like when shrapnel moved through muscle and bone, in whatever part of the human consciousness stores the image of a man approaching with a sword, and the knowledge that the next 3 seconds will determine everything. Elab carried Tarawa for 7 decades before he wrote his letter to his old battalion. 7 decades during which the world changed so completely that the young man who had walked onto that beach would not have recognized most of what it became. 7 decades during which the enemies became allies, during which the Pacific atoll that had cost so much became a protected historical site, during which the entire context that had made that battle necessary was dismantled and replaced by something different. And yet the beach remained in him. The sword remained. The moment when he had looked at the officer and the officer had looked at him, and the next thing that happened had not yet happened. That moment remained, perfectly preserved, the way only the most extreme moments are preserved, crystalline and complete, available for retrieval at any time the mind chose to retrieve it. He was 93 years old and his balance was a little off. He felt okay. And somewhere in the preserved archive of everything he had experienced, the beach at Battle was still there, still happening, always happening, the way the most formative moments of a life always are. Not haunting him, perhaps. Perhaps by 93, a man has made his peace with what he has survived, has integrated it into the larger story of himself in a way that is not comfortable, exactly, but is at least settled. Perhaps he had looked at the warrant officer enough times in memory that the looking had become something he could sit beside without flinching. Perhaps not. He did not say. What he said was, "I recovered all right." And in the saying of it, in that plain, undefended American statement, there is something that contains the whole of him. Not the battle, not the sword, not the 50% disability, not the 7 decades that followed. All of it together, resolved into 4 words that ask for nothing and offer everything. The Battle of Tarawa changed the way America fought the Pacific War. The lessons learned in blood on that tiny atoll, about amphibious planning, about the limits of pre-landing bombardment, about the necessity of accurate reef surveys, about command and communication under fire. Those lessons were written into doctrine and carried forward into every subsequent landing operation. The men who died at BTO did not die for nothing, though that is cold comfort to anyone who loved them. Their deaths produced knowledge that was immediately and urgently applied, and the application of that knowledge saved lives, specific, nameable, countable lives, in operations that came after. That is the strange, uncomfortable economy of warfare. The dead purchase something for the living, and the living carry the debt. John L. Elab survived. He carried his share of the debt, the 50% disability, the balance that was never quite right after the beach, the body that had been permanently altered by the interaction between his flesh and Japanese ordnance and Japanese steel. He carried it without complaint, or at least without recorded complaint, for the rest of his long life. He lived to be the kind of old man that countries produce when they are lucky, and the young men they send into their worst moments somehow find the thread back to ordinary life and follow it for 7 decades until they are sitting in Boise, Idaho, with a journalist asking them about the Pacific, and they answer plainly and without adornment because they have long since stopped needing the adornment. There is a version of this story that would have been different. In that version, the grenade is 2 feet closer, or the warrant officer is faster, or the arm that goes over the head does not go far enough, or the hand that reaches for the sword misses in the fraction of a second available. In that version, Elab does not write his letter in 2014. He does not tell a journalist in Boise that his balance is a little off. He does not offer 5 words of gratitude to the men and women currently serving. In that version, he is one of the more than 1,000 Americans who died at BTO, and his name is on a list somewhere, and someone who loved him grieved for him, and that is all. Instead, he lived. He grabbed the sword. He got him. And then he lived for 70 more years and said thank you and meant it with everything he had. That is not a small thing. That is not a simple thing. That is a man who was handed an impossible moment and answered it correctly, not because he was superhuman, not because he was incapable of fear, but because in the most fundamental sense available to a human being, in the sense of the raw, animal, unconquerable insistence on continuing, he refused to stop. The beach at BTO is quiet now. The reef is still there. The water is still shallow where the landing craft went aground. The coral has healed over much of what was done to it. The bones of the men who died there, thousands of them, American and Japanese and Korean, are still being recovered, still being identified, still being returned to families who have waited across entire lifetimes for an accounting. The battle is still being completed in that sense. The last casualty of Tarawa has not yet been found. But John L. Elab came home, and he stayed home, and he lived. And that, in the end, is the whole of it. If this story moved you, if John L. Elab's words and his survival, and the sheer weight of what one man carried for 70 years left something in you that needs a moment to settle, then please consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like on this video. It takes only a second, but it means that stories like this one, Stories of ordinary men who did extraordinary things and then simply went home and lived, continue to find the audiences they deserve. And I want to ask you something. When John L. Elab looked at that Japanese officer on the beach and the officer looked back at him, there was a moment, a human moment, before violence. What do you think passed between them? What does it mean that two men from opposite sides of a world war could look at each other, really look at each other, in the middle of the worst battle either of them would ever see? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one of them, and this question deserves more than one answer.